Right? It was all great and wonderful until you add that. And it's just the reality of walking with Jesus. John chapter 16, Jesus promises that the world will hate those who follow him. And that's just something to be accepted. Christians sometimes don't want to be the weird ones or the odd man out, but that's what they're called to be. We're not called to be like everybody else. In fact, I've heard it said before that if you don't have any haters, you should be asking some questions about your identity in Christ. Are you living like Jesus? Jesus had haters. All the disciples had haters. And if everybody likes you, everybody gets along with you, do we look more like the world? Now, if everybody around you is Christian, then that's a different story, right? Because if all the Christians should like you, all the Christians should get along with you. But if the world is the ones, all your non-Christian friends think you're the best thing since sliced bread, that is, there's some questions to be had, because Jesus said that is not the case. Yeah, so Jesus gives his third passion prediction right before he's going to enter into Jerusalem. And then we have this request of James and John. Now, we mentioned this on the first day, but James and John are not asking for thrones in heaven. They're asking for seats in Jerusalem. So that when they enter into Jerusalem, because they're almost there, right? They're going up to Jerusalem. And when they're almost there, they say, okay, when we get there, can we sit at your right and left hand when you come into your glory, into your kingdom? Their minds are very much on earth. And Jesus says to them, are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? And that's referring to his trial and his persecution and his crucifixion. Right? The cup that he is going to drink is the cup of his death on the cross. And they say, yes, we can drink it, not knowing really what it is that they're going to drink. Right? They have no idea. Right? And he says, you will, right? You will drink the cup that I drink. And James definitely will. James is the first martyr in the church. He's going to be killed only a few years after Jesus. In Acts chapter 12, he gets beheaded right before Peter is arrested. So Jesus does affirm that. But what does he mean by right and his left, where he says, oh, there's others who that's prepared for? Does he mean that there's going to be somebody else sitting next to Jesus at his right and left hand in heaven? He says that when I come into my glory, right, but to sit at my right and left hand is not mine to grant, but for those to whom it has been prepared. Jesus is probably talking about the two thieves that would be crucified next to him on his right and his left. Right? Those ones to whom it has been prepared that when I am glorified, they will be on my right and my left hand. And that's probably who Jesus is talking about. Given the context of his passion prediction, of the cup that he's going to have to drink, all of that, the whole scenario is referring to his crucifixion. And so most likely that is what he's talking about here, is his crucifixion, and thus in the same way. Now, what he gets at the end here is this heart of service, that his whole ambition was not to be raised up, to be honored, to be exalted, but to serve. And that's the question for any reader of the gospel, is that, do they have the same attitude as Jesus? Do we think like Jesus thinks, and take the place of service in our lives? Is that our response? And this makes a great key verse for the book. You're still looking for one? 10:45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It sums up Jesus' whole goal, his ministry goal, his ambition is to come to serve. And John and James were thinking about honor and exaltation, being lifted up and recognized. And what Jesus says is that when you are beginning to think like that, what you need to remember is that I came to serve. And I think it's for anybody, for any Christian that would think about being raised up, lifted up, honored, exalted, a place of ministry, being a ministry leader, anything like that. I think those attacks from the enemy, which are the same ones that he gave to Jesus in the wilderness, being exalted and raised up and honored before man, that we have got to remember that Jesus did not come to do that. When he came to serve. And I think that is an important reflection to have, that in the place of temptation, to crave or desire position, that our ambition would be to serve. Because that's what Jesus did. And it doesn't matter what the Christian world around us tells us or shows us. We look at Jesus. He is our model. I think that's super, super important. So chapter 11, Jesus is in Jericho at the end of chapter 10 with Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus is a blind man who sees and understands who Jesus is. He cries out, Son of David, right? And the irony is that you have the crowds who all see Jesus but don't understand who he is. And this blind man who cries out, recognizing who Jesus actually is. Right? So that's the irony is he's about to enter into Jerusalem and sees that everybody is going to reject him. They not necessarily reject him, but they will misunderstand who he is. Now, in riding into Jerusalem, we mentioned, I think on Monday, this is a fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, as Jesus enters in riding on a donkey. And the shouts of the people is this Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. And that word Hosanna means save us. And they're really saying save us from the Romans, right? Blessed is the kingdom of God. Blessed is his coming kingdom of our father David. All of these things are reflections upon the exaltation of God's kingdom being reestablished in Jerusalem. And that's what they're thinking. When they lay palm branches down in front of him, this is what was done for Judas Maccabeus. And it's written about in the book of Maccabees, that when he had taken back Jerusalem from the Greeks, everybody put palm branches down in front of him and welcomed him in as a hero. Now, this has no other precedent in the Old Testament. The book of Maccabees is the first place we see it. And so the parallel is super sharp. That when Jesus comes riding in, they think he's riding in like Judas to take the city away from the Romans. Now, I don't think they think he's going to do it right in that moment. He's not coming with a band of soldiers, but that's the expectation. And of course, he rides in, he sees the temple, and then he goes back out to Bethlehem. It's pretty late in the day, probably. He's walked all the way from Jerusalem. And so there's no time to do what needs to be done, which will happen in the next story. So in the next story, Jesus is rolling up to Jerusalem, and we get this Markan sandwich where we have the fig tree that's cursed, and then the temple reformation, and then the comment on the fig tree that has withered. Okay, so these stories they go hand in hand. And so Jesus comes up to the fig tree and sees that it doesn't have figs on it, but it has leaves. And he curses it. Now, it's not because he's hangry. At this point in the year, Passover, which would be about this time, a few weeks from now, fig trees would have leaves on them, and they should begin to have little bits of fruit. Now, they wouldn't be ripe yet. Jesus isn't looking for ripe fruit, I don't think. But I think when he comes up to the tree, he sees there's nothing on it. Like there's no sign of fruitfulness on this tree. And so he speaks a curse over it. Now, Jesus is doing this symbolically in light of what he's going to do next. And so he goes into Jerusalem to the temple and starts flipping tables. Now, why does he start flipping tables? Okay, what we need to be careful to do is not to dichotomize religion and economics. Okay, these things went hand in hand. So he's not saying that this is an economic issue and you're just extorting people, right? He's saying this is a God issue, right? And you are keeping people from honoring God, right? That's the big issue at hand. Okay, now what happened basically with the temple is that the temple would provide availability of animals for people who traveled from far distances. So imagine it, I mean, you might have talked about this already, but you travel from Turkey, right? Let's say you live in Ephesus, and you're going to travel to Jerusalem for Passover, and you're going to bring a lamb. Well, the chances could happen that on your way bringing the lamb, it breaks its leg, or it falls and gets a cut in it, or its ear gets ripped, or its eye, something damage happens to it, by the time you get to Jerusalem, it's an unacceptable sacrifice. So what the temple began to do is they said, okay, why don't you sell your animal there, get the money, and then come to Jerusalem and then buy an animal from us. And so what the interesting thing is the temple kept thousands of sheep, right? And they tended the flocks of what were called the Passover lambs at Bethlehem. And this is written about by Alfred Edersheim. And the sheep were kept at Bethlehem for Passover. And when the angels appear to the shepherds at Bethlehem in the book of Luke, they're probably appearing to the shepherds of the Passover lambs, telling them that the Passover lamb has come and been born in Bethlehem. So it's an interesting parallel that Jesus, born in Bethlehem, is the same place where the Passover lambs are all cared for and brought up. But you come and you buy your animal from the temple, and it makes a lot of sense, right? It's a very wise thing to do. And what ended up happening is that the temple was extorting people, charging them more money. And basically they did that through a bad exchange rate, because the temple would not accept Roman coins, because Roman coins had Caesar on them. And so they only accepted Jewish coins, or Tyrian shekels is what they were mostly using. And the Tyrian shekel had no images on it. It had just leaves on it. And that's what they used for buying and selling. Now, they are upcharging people like crazy, and they're basically turning the temple into a den of robbers. Okay, and this is the big deal for Jesus, because he's quoting from two passages here when he calls the temple a den of robbers, from Jeremiah 7:11. And from Isaiah 56:7. And I think that the one primarily in his mind is probably Jeremiah chapter 7, because the state of Jerusalem is ripe for judgment in the eyes of Jesus. And in the book of Jeremiah chapter 7, that's basically what Jeremiah says, is this place is ripe for judgment. And so the parallel cannot be more clear, that these people at Jeremiah's time were idolatrous and rebellious, and they did not care about the temple of God being used to honor God, but to honor themselves. And they thought they could just trust in a building. And the same thing is going on in the time of Jesus. But when Jesus flips the tables, he's not just making an economic statement. Because what happens when people can't buy animals? The sacrifices stop. This is a judgment on the temple. This is a judgment on the fact that they have distorted what the temple was for. And they are not honoring God, they're honoring themselves. And so it's not as much about stopping the selling of animals, because you have to do that. It makes a lot of sense. It's the most wise thing to do when you have a ton of people from all over the empire. They can't bring their own animals. You've got to sell them. But the ways that they're doing it to honor themselves rather than God is what Jesus is confronting. And so this temple sacrifices cease. And then, we have the verse references here. And so Jesus goes out of the temple. And the next morning, as they're walking up, they see the fig tree that has withered. Now, in the prophets, Israel is occasionally referred to as a fig tree. And so the parallel cannot be missed. That the fig tree being cursed is not just because Jesus was angry, but because Israel is barren. They are a fruitless city. And Jerusalem is not bearing the fruit that God had desired them to bear for the nations. That's the big thing that's going on. That when God comes to find a harvest, there is nothing but leaves. And so the fig tree's demise reflects the demise of Jerusalem. And when Jesus says to the disciples about prayer, and he says to them, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea. Well, what mountain is this mountain? The mountain is the temple, is the mountain on which the temple's been built. And what did we see thrown into the sea before? The pigs, right? It's this picture of sending things, these evil things, back to the place where they came from. So Jesus is saying the temple, the system has become so corrupt, Jerusalem has become so corrupt, they are ripe for judgment. And when you pray and you say that this mountain be cast into the sea, well, that will happen as it is so inevitable. that this mountain will be thrown away. So Jesus will begin to have these confrontations with the temple, with the leaders in the temple. And these conversations are going to start in 11:27 and really go on through the rest of chapter 12. And the end of chapter 12, he'll leave the temple and go out and have a conversation with his disciples in chapter 13. So one thing to pay attention to is, who is Jesus talking to? Okay, from chapter 11:27 through the end of chapter 12, who is Jesus talking to? Well, right in 11:27, there's some people to pay attention to. So why don't you guys read that verse? And who is questioning Jesus? They're right there. Anybody can tell me.
Chief priests, scribes, and elders.
Yeah, chief priests, scribes, and elders. Now that should stand out to us, because these are the people that Jesus has said 3 times will hand him over to be crucified. Okay. So in chapter 9, verse 21, he says, he'll be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. In chapter 10, he'll say, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. And now you have the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders coming to Jesus. And each one of the confrontations that comes up here is with these people. Okay, so just to pay attention as you go through here. Now, so the confrontations Jesus is having is not with the crowds. Okay, the crowds love Jesus. The crowds just welcomed him in as their king. The crowds believe that Jesus is the Messiah. The crowds are for him. We have to be really aware the leaders are the ones who are against Jesus. And that will play a big part in the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus in chapters 14 and 15. But the crowds love him, and the crowds are for him. So as Jesus begins to talk, he tells this parable of the tenants. And what we want to have in our mind is Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah chapter 5, God talks about Israel as a vineyard that he has planted. He has established Israel as this nation, as a vineyard to produce good fruit, to be a place that provides for the nations, is a light to the world, all these types of things. So Isaiah 5 should be in the mind of anybody reading the parable of the tenants, because the tenants who are meant to take care of the vineyard are the leaders. Okay? The tenants are meant to take care of the vineyard, the nation. And so the leasing of the vineyard to these tenants would be the leadership in Israel. The kings, or in this case, the priests and the elders and the scribes, are the ones to whom the vineyard has been leased. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is that these tenants leasing this vineyard are supposed to give back glory to the owner of the vineyard. And in this sense, they're supposed to give some of the crop back to him in tribute, but instead they keep it for themselves. They are only concerned with their own glory. And what happens is the master, he sends back servant after servant after servant. And these are the prophets. The prophets throughout the history of Israel that God had sent to the nation of Israel in primary confrontation to the leaders. When you read the prophets, you will see that they are primarily confronting the leadership in the nation. Okay, and so the prophets confront the leadership over and over and over. And in this case, the servants come to the tenants over and over and over. The servants of who? The master. The prophets are the servants of Yahweh. That's what he calls them. And so what the last one that comes in is the son. Okay, the son is sent from the master to the tenants. And what do? They reject and they kill him, just like all of the servants. Okay. What then happens? What happens then at the end of this parable? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Okay, that's really important to pay attention to, because this is what Jesus sees the direction of history going. Okay, he sees history headed in this direction. Verse 9. He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Okay, that's important for chapter 13. Now, the leaders are perceptive enough to be aware that, oh, he's talking about us, and they're disturbed at him and upset, but they're not going to arrest him. Why? Because the crowds love him. Everybody is all for Jesus, and so they're not going to try to chance it when everybody that loves him is around, and they would be seen as the bad guys. The next story, Jesus is put into a trap about taxes. Now, why is this a big issue for the Jews? Why is it a problem that they should pay these taxes? Well, Jews didn't like to be reminded of their oppression by the Romans and the opposition force that occupied their land. And there were many Jews who didn't like to use Roman coins because they had an image of Caesar on them. And any depiction of a human being was seen as an idol. So the coin that had the image on it is seen as an idol. And there is even testimony that Roman coins were restricted from even being present in the temple precincts because it was bringing an idol into the temple. And idolatry in the temple is what prior had led to the exile of Israel by Babylon in 586. So they try to keep all of the idols out of the temple, and because it has an image on it, it's thought of as an idol. So when they come to him and say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? What is Jesus' first response to them? Bring me a denarius. Bring me one of those coins that has Caesar's image on it. Okay, so he's making a pretty bold statement here. Now, they brought one. And it probably would have been something they had to go and find. It's not like it was in their pocket. They had to bring one to him. Okay, that shows they had to go find it. Okay, so this is their kind of thinking, right? So Jesus has this coin, of course, and the coin that Jesus would have held would have had the image of Tiberius Caesar on it. And on it, it would have said, Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Okay, that is the claim. Caesar has just claimed himself to be the Son of God. And on the back of the Tiberius denarius, it says high priest. Now, you could not get more confrontational with the Jews if you tried. The claim that the emperor of Rome is the true high priest and that he is the Son of a God couldn't have been more offensive. And so just having the coin lays it on thick enough. But to say, give back to Caesar what has Caesar's image on it, in a roundabout way of saying, pay your taxes, is a pretty bold statement, of course. But even more so than that, to say, give to God what is God's, implies that you all bear the image of God, just like this coin bears the image of Caesar. And you, who bear the image of God, need to give back to God your life the same way that you would give back to Caesar the thing that has his image on it. Obviously, if it has his face on it, it belongs to him. And so if you bear God's image, you belong to God. And so it's not an issue about taxes. The issue is about your devotion to Yahweh. Now, how would this have impacted your readers in Rome who are facing the Neronian persecution, who completely disagree with Nero, are facing death, and now are being told to pay their taxes to him? He can kill you at any time he wants to. As soon as he finds out you're a Christian, you have a mark on your head. But give him your money. This goes back to Romans chapter 13, where Paul talks about paying taxes. That had been written 6 years before or so, depending on what you date Romans, 6 years before the fire in Rome. These people know, they've had this question before about paying taxes. And this is, again, an affirmation of giving back to Caesar what Caesar is due of his own. And the point being, primarily, that they need to give to God what is God's. Right? And that calls for a relentless devotion despite the circumstances they're facing. Because it's not about the money, it's about their life. That's the bigger issue at hand. The question of whether we should pay taxes to someone who's persecuting us is not as big of an issue as are you giving your life to your heavenly Father? So the Sadducees then come to him. The Pharisees and the Herodians weren't able to trap him. The other thing about that is the Pharisees and the Herodians coming together over a question about taxes is if Jesus had said, don't pay your taxes, the Herodians would have had him arrested for treason. And if he said, pay your taxes, then the Pharisees would have said they would have completely rejected him. And they would have denounced Jesus as someone who sided with the Romans. So that's why it's important that the Pharisees and the Herodians are there, is because Jesus' response traps both of them at the same time. Okay. So the next question, the Sadducees come to him, this question of resurrection. And it's a pretty straightforward response from Jesus. I don't think there's a lot of uncertainty in it. He basically says, you guys are wrong. Then to take the first 5 books of the Bible, the only portion of scripture that they take to be authoritative, and to say you have misunderstood your own books is quite a strike on the head for them, right? Because Jesus takes the passage from the burning bush, one of the most important passages, the call of Moses, the revelation of God by his name Yahweh, and says this passage right here, the one that you say is so important, God's first revelation of his name to his people, is actually the passage I'm going to use to prove resurrection to you. Right, so that's a pretty bold confrontation. One of the most important passages in the Old in their scripture, the Pentateuch. Now, how does this prove resurrection? So in verse 28 or 26, it says, and as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. He doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham. I was the God of Jacob. I was the God of Isaac. He says, I am their God, implying their presence with him in heaven. And thus implying the future resurrection of their bodies. Okay, so that's how Jesus is proving it. So if that seems like, well, why is he quoting that passage? Doesn't say anything about resurrection. It's all about the verb tense. Okay, that's why he says he's the God of the living, because they are with him presently. Okay. And then a scribe comes to Jesus with this question of what is the most important commandment? And this is a good test for Jesus, because if he is somebody who claims to be doing the will of God and bringing God's kingdom, then certainly he should have an answer for the question of the greatest commandment. Now, this was a common question of the day. Many Pharisees, scribes, lawyers, the Sadducees were all discussing the question of which one is the most important one. And so what Jesus takes it back to is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he brings in Leviticus 19:8. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this is the basics of all of the law. In fact, the 10 Commandments can be divided up into these 2 camps. Right? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to idols. Don't take the Lord's name in vain and honor the Sabbath. Are all ways that people love God. And then to honor your father and mother, not to kill, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness, and not to covet are ways that you love your neighbor. And so that essence, and then what people would then comment on is that the entire law can be summed up in the 10 Commandments, and that the entire law is expansion of those initial 10 instructions from God. So then in that case, every single law can be broken down into loving God and loving people. And that's what Jesus is saying to this scribe. Now, the scribe, of course, he says, you've answered very well. And it is one of the few times that a questioner of Jesus, someone who comes to Jesus to try to trap him, is commended for their response. Because he says to him, truly, those are much more important than all of the sacrifices and all of the other laws. And Jesus commends him. So it should cause us to take a step back for a second and say, wow, like Jesus actually commends somebody for their answer. Now, what are these commands? Well, when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, in the book of Deuteronomy, those things are all synonymous with one another, right? Love God, and the essential statement is love God with everything that you are in all of your life. Now, many of us think about our priority list, and we have this 1, 2, 3, and maybe we'll say God is up here, and then you've got family, and then maybe you have ministry here. Okay. And a lot of our lives are organized like that. What is the most important thing in my life? Now, what happens when you actually spend more time with your ministry than you do with your quiet times with God, or more time with your family than you do reading the Bible? What really shows the priority in your life? Is it the time that you spend, or is it the way that you feel about the thing? And God's desire hasn't been to be number one. Okay? His desire is not to be the first on your list. Okay? His desire is to be the middle of your list. So that your list doesn't look like 1, 2, 3, but your list looks like everything comes from God. So whether that's work, or family, or ministry, or sports, whatever you do, that God is the center of all of it. And that's what Jesus' instruction is: love the Lord your God with everything. No matter what you do or where you are, or where you go, God is to be the middle of everything in their lives, the center. It's not about the first priority, because when God is in the middle of everything, he's involved in all areas of your life, clearly placing him in that position if you would like to still use the list idea. Now, the next portion, to love your neighbor as yourself, has brought a lot of odd teachings into Christianity, where we have promoted self-love. And we've often promoted this idea, well, you have to love yourself well before you can love others well. And that is not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not promoting this idea that you have to love yourself really well before you can love others well. But he is saying that in the same way that you would love yourself is how you should love others. It has nothing to do with loving yourself first. This whole idea of self-love, glorification of self, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying hate yourself. That's not what I'm saying, or that people should. But oftentimes what people will say is that I need to learn to love myself first before I love other people. They're like, no, absolutely not. That's not what Jesus means by that. Okay. This is a guideline. It's an instruction for how to love others. Now, the simple statement then would be, well, I don't know how to love myself. Well, how would you like to be loved? And that's how you love others. The golden rule, as we commonly call it, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, is the essence of this command. What does that mean? What does it mean to do unto others as you would have others do unto you? Well, the way that command is worded, and kind of this instruction as well, is that when you have a desire that someone would treat you a certain way, that is the prompting of the Spirit in your life to treat someone else that way. So when you're like, man, I wish that someone would hang out with me. I wish someone would ask me to coffee. I wish someone would buy me an ice cream. Those are the prompting of the Spirit of God in our lives to do that for other people. That in the same way we would like somebody to hang out with us or to spend time with us, or I wish someone would ask me for a one-on-one. Great, go and ask them. It's a call for initiative in the body of Christ. I used to have so much self-pity in my life. Why doesn't anybody like me? Why doesn't anybody hang out with me? Whatever, so much self-pity, just pitying myself so much. And God was like, well, why don't you take that and go in the opposite spirit, which is a classic why I'm teaching. Move in the opposite spirit and do for others what you wish they would do for you. And that is the essence of the golden rule. It's the essence of what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says that sums up the entirety of the law. Now, after the questions have come to Jesus, then Jesus asks a question of the people, right? So now it's his turn to trap them. And the funny thing is these three questions that come to Jesus, he resolves all of them but then he asks a question to the leaders and they can't figure it out. Okay, so he's the one who actually traps them. It just shows this battle of wits that goes on and Jesus' superiority over them. But did you guys talk about this passage? Who the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Who is David's Lord? Did you guys talk about it? Is it confusing? Do you guys understand the passage? Okay, well, I'm going to read the whole thing here. It's very short. It's just a couple verses, so we'll walk through it real quick. And Jesus taught in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, in the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And the great throng heard him with gladness, because he had confounded the leaders. So the crowds are like, good job, Jesus. You have confounded the leaders. So what does this mean? Well, the basic thought is that the Messiah is the son of David, and that means that David is greater than the Messiah. The Father is naturally superior to the Son. Okay, that was the cultural belief of the time. So how can David say to the Messiah, and call him my Lord, when David is technically greater than him? That's the question Jesus is getting at. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Because the passage here in Hebrew reads, Yahweh said to my Adonai. Okay, so Lord and Lord are both translated as kurios in Greek. That's why they read the same. But in Hebrew, there are two different words. Yahweh, which is translated Lord, or the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, and it's smaller. And then L-O-R-D, Lord, is what is being talked about here. So there are two different figures. One is the Messiah, but the real question is about son, being the Son and authority and all that kind of thing. And so basically, Jesus confounds them by saying that the Messiah is greater than David. That's whether, if there's any confusion. Then we have the widow's offering here, and then we'll take a break. So the widow's offering is a very important lesson because of what it teaches to the disciples and any listeners with Jesus. So the temple, and to understand the situation, you've got to understand how things work. So in the temple, people could bring in their offerings to the temple and throw them into these bins. Now, in the bins, when they brought the offering, there was a funnel that funneled in the coins, because there's so many people coming to the temple that you can't just slip it in the offering box. It's not like there's a ton of churches, you can just bring your offering to the synagogue. They would bring it directly to the temple. And so with the offering box, you can't just slip it in there. And they're not going to leave these giant vats of coins. People just toss their coins in there. So they have funnels that lead down into these boxes. And what people would do, the report or the testimony is that you'd have people like the Pharisees or the Sadducees who would come with a pocket full of money and throw it into these funnels. Now, these funnels are made of brass. So anytime you throw metal into them, it clings super loud. And so if you're a Pharisee and you walk up with a bag of money and you drop it in there, everybody knows how much you give. And so when the widow comes and she has these two very small coins, okay, these aren't big, they're very, very small, like the size of your pinky nail coins. Okay, and she drops them in, ding, ding. And you have these Pharisees and Sadducees, the people, ding, 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 ding. You just hear the very loud, and this widow into the offering box. Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, she gave more than everybody. It's oxymoronic. There's no way that's true. Technically, she has not, but in light of what she has, possession-wise, she has given the most. The amount of money that she's given, which it calls it a penny, is about, it says that is about a 64th of a day's wages. Okay, so it's a 64th of a denarius, which would be just in the United States, it'd be about $1.50. So she brings $1.50, and that's what her offering is. That's all she had to live on that day. And I think YWAMers know this lesson probably better than most, is that it's not about how much is given, but the heart in which it's given with. And the generosity is not gauged by the volume, but by the cost. And generosity is a key concept in the kingdom of God for all people to learn spirit of generosity. When I was in my SBS, I had alluded to the story yesterday. When I was in my SBS, I had started the SBS and didn't have enough money to finish the school. And so it got to the end of the first quarter, and I had always kind of struggled with finances for my first few years in YWAM. And had heard this phrase over and over, like, you can't outgive God. And I'm like, yeah, but if you have to pay for outreach or rent, like, and you give all your money to somebody else and you can't pay for your outreach or your rent, then what's going to happen? You know, like, you have to pay for things. So this whole idea of you can't outgive God was something that I had on my mind, was super skeptical about, and I didn't have the money to finish my SBS. And so I asked the Lord, what do I do? How am I going to pay for the school? And I felt like as I was doing a timeless truth about generosity, I was asking the Lord, how do I finish out the school? And I felt like he said, if you are generous, if you give to every person that you see that asks for money, that not just needs money, but asks for it in the next 8 months or 7 months of the school, then you will finish with more money in your bank account than when you started. I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And I tried to be as relentlessly obedient to that as possible. I had never been so generous in my life up to that point. And I was giving to anybody and everybody. I mean, beggars on the streets, people on Facebook, like anytime anybody asked for money, I would give them money. And sometimes it was only a couple bucks. And sometimes I had just gotten a check and I'd give like $300, you know, like it was all over the place. You know, and I gave and I gave and I gave, and I was never without, and all the money that I needed for school was provided for, even though I was giving so much away. And I got to the end of the year, I got to the end of the school, and I didn't have more money in my bank account than when I started. But I got to the end of the year 2 weeks later, so we finished right around Christmas, 2 weeks later. And it was just after Christmas. I was asking the Lord, like, my bank account isn't bigger at the end of the year. And his question to me was it about what you get, or was it about what you learned? And it's like, it's about what I learned, you know, so much. A couple of days later, I opened the mailbox and there's a $10,000 check in there, which is the most I've ever received in my life, and was about triple the amount I had in my bank account when I started SBS. The Lord was faithful to what he had spoken, but it taught such an important lesson and has led to a principle of generosity in my life, that in every moment when I've seen somebody ask for money, that the call in my heart has never been, should I give, but how much can I give to them? And that is always the question that we need to come to God with. In fact, I've heard Lauren say it from the stage when taking offerings in Ohanakort, or at our base meetings in Kona, is that when you pray in an offering, the question is never, should I give in this offering? It is always, how much should I give in this offering? Because God always wants to give. And God is a generous giver. And so when we see this story, what we learn is that it has nothing to do with the amount that can be given, and everything to do with the heart that has to give. And so for any of us, there is never an excuse to not be generous. If a widow can give $1.50, and Jesus says she's given more than anybody today, then we can surely give even a few cents into an offering to honor God. It is all about the heart. All right, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll start at 11:15. And then we'll just go until 12:15.
No. Come on. Wait.
I know Mark. He's yeah, okay. Yeah. So we think. Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Nice. Yeah, I love it. Well, it's fine. I started as like as much as it was like man, and then I've been able to keep up. Except 2 weeks ago. So that was 2 weeks. So like, good. How was the artist? Was good. Yeah. But yeah, it's a bit fast. No, so far. Yeah. It's just the back, you know. Oh no! Maybe like during after lunch. I think maybe just started today. Sounds good. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, cool. Always good stretch. Just like, sorry, I saw you stretching it back to class. So here. You 16? No.
I didn't see you guys. Nice. What's you talking about? I don't think so. It's fun to slow. Yes.
Come on. I didn't think about it. It was done. Yeah.
Okay, so much real.
Okay.
That is all. That is good.
And then balance, running a really hard. With a small break.
Oh, do you?
I remember.
I think it depends on how. Cause like, you know, like a.
Yeah. Like, yeah, like this. That's. Well, like, based on like, when I was sitting down, and somebody was there, and I probably.
Honestly, yeah. I think, I don't know. It's like unnecessary. But like, it's okay because, yeah. I don't know how to think like. We're gonna see something from it, not
All right. Let's press on. We're gonna finish out the book. Chapters 13 through 16. About this next hour or so. Easy. Yeah. Are there any questions or anything we can kind of rush through in the last? Yeah.
There was one, so the person questioned Jesus about what's the greatest commandment. Is there any like clues about his heart posture behind him questioning who he was questioning, tracking or just really curious?
I don't think he was trying to trap him. I think he was trying to bring resolution. So it says, one of the scribes came up to him and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him. So he's not trying to trap him in that way. It's what he looks at, he says, okay, Jesus answered these guys really well. So I wonder what he would say to this question. And that seems to be the right part.
That was just a common question to ask.
Yeah, not a common question asked in a dispute, but it was a common question that was being discussed at the time. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So, can somebody read chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 for us?
And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down."
Okay, great. So these verses set the context for the whole chapter. You guys probably have a paragraph break right after this, right? And does it say the signs of the end of the age?
Yes.
Okay, that's interpretation. And that is not something that is in the original text. Okay, that's an interpretive title. And the paragraph break here is incredibly pesky because it doesn't fit well with the context of the whole chapter. Okay, so when we're looking at this whole chapter, we're wanting to think of it all in the context of what Jesus has just been asked by the disciples. And then his response about that, because everything that follows is going to be kind of a comment on the initial 2 verses of this chapter. Okay, where are they talking in the next verse? So read verse 3. Where are they? Okay, Mount of Olives. Do you guys know where that is in relation to Jerusalem?
It is opposite of the temple.
It is opposite of the temple. Good, just like it says. Okay. So what does that look like? Okay, this is a view from the Mount of Olives. All right, it's a pixelated picture, so I'm going to go to a better one next. But I wanted to show you the scope of the Temple Mount. Okay, because where the area is the same as it was in Jesus' day, size-wise. Okay, so it goes from here all the way to here. Okay, that's the whole Temple Mount that was built by Herod around the time of Jesus' birth. Okay, so huge, it is huge. And the disciples are sitting, maybe not here, but somewhere, and the Mount of Olives overlooks the temple. So you can look into the temple precincts. And the Dome of the Rock is here, but the temple was right about here, kind of in the middle of the whole area. Very tall. It would have been maybe double the size of the Dome of the Rock, height-wise. It was huge, glistening white, beautiful gold trim, smoke coming up from the altar of sacrifice right in front of the temple. This is what they're looking at, okay? So they're looking at this beautiful building, and Jesus is saying to his disciples, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Okay, so you want to have the whole geographical setting in mind, all right? So here's another picture that's a little nicer. Here you go.
So would the temple have it wouldn't have filled out that whole space? Because
No.
So
About here. Yeah. So these courts, this is all like open space. There was no trees. Okay, so no trees in here at all. And there were courts right here, and that's like the court of the Gentiles. That's where Jesus is flipping the tables. And then around the outside, all around the perimeter of here is this colonnade. Where a colonnade is where there's pillars, and it's kind of a breezeway. And so that's where people would sit and talk and discuss. They wouldn't sit in the hot sun. This is where all like the things were happening out here. But the colonnade is where people would sit and talk and that kind of stuff. If you see right here, it's very small to you, but there's stairs. This is a big staircase. It's very wide. It is more than 50 feet wide. And then they filled them in now, but if you were there, you can see archways. There's about 4 or 5 archways in here. That was the main entrance to the temple. That's probably where Jesus would probably have gone into most often. But this picture gives a better image. Over here, this kind of road down here that goes down to the valleys where Jesus probably rode into Jerusalem when he came on the donkey, because Bethany is around the Mount of Olives, and he's coming from Bethany. He's coming down this way through the valley, and then he enters into the courts of the temple right away. So that's, well, there you go, some geographical context for the temple in chapter 13. So we open up with this verse. The temple is going to be destroyed. Okay, that sets the tone for the whole chapter. Now, when are all of these stones thrown down? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. When does that happen? Okay. Pretty much undisputed 70 AD. Okay. The Romans come and they take the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They destroy the city and they burn the temple, throwing it down, just completely destroying it. Okay. Pretty much fully accepted 70 AD. At the conclusion of the first Jewish revolt, which was Jerusalem was the epicenter of that. And so the uprising of that first Jewish revolt spread throughout Israel, up into Syria, and even down into Egypt. So the first Jewish revolt happened in this huge area, what is called or known as the Levant, which stretches from just South Palestine all the way up to Syria. It was an incredible political crisis and happened to take place at the same time as the persecution of Christians in Rome, and then the eventual suicide of Nero. And when the empire is in such, I would say, tumultuous circumstances where their emperor is dead, there's no ruling power, the Jews are revolting, and a big portion of the Roman military is in Israel fighting against the Jews. And then they're trying to struggle to figure out who is the emperor, because Nero does not have a descendant to take the throne. Okay. So his suicide leaves an incredible power vacuum. Okay. And that will be important as we continue on. But eventually, the empire will be stabilized by Vespasian. Vespasian was the primary general who was leading the opposition against the Jewish revolt in Israel. And so when he leaves Israel and goes to Rome to assert himself as the new emperor and take the throne by force, he leaves his son Titus. Titus is the general of the army then left in Vespasian's place. Titus will lead the conquest of Jerusalem, burning of the temple, destroying it, and then he brings all of the temple goods from the temple in Jerusalem to Rome. And if you go to Rome, to the Forum, and you buy a ticket and go into the Forum, you can see Titus's arch. And it's this stone arch that is maybe, I mean, the bottom of it is about like maybe 5 feet taller than this roof or the ceiling here. Okay. And the whole thing is maybe, I would say almost the height of 2 stories. And inside of the arch are pictures carved inside of it, and show depictions of people carrying a menorah into the city of Rome in conquest of the Jews, and there's Jewish slaves marching behind them. Okay. So they viewed the conquest and destruction of the temple, they viewed it in Rome as an affirmation of Vespasian's emperorship. Okay, so that's how the Romans are thinking of this event. Okay, the Jews are thinking of it as an ultimate destruction of their people. Okay, so we have 2 major worldviews going on. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Now, Vespasian, he was the one who was primarily leading that and left Titus in his place. And so that's what's going on here. Now, what's Jesus talking about then? These signs of the times. Okay, so when Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking over the temple at this building that everybody was like, this is the most beautiful building that's ever been built. In fact, people were saying it was the most beautiful building in the whole Roman Empire. Okay. And Jesus is saying it's going to be destroyed. Okay. And in 40 years, it will come to pass. But at this point in time, there is nothing even close to alluding to that happening. So Jesus is speaking at a point where everyone would have just been shocked at what he's saying. Okay. And they're like, okay, Jesus, if that's going to happen, then how do we know it's going to happen? What are the signs of this happening? Okay, so the whole conversation is in light of the destruction of the temple. Okay, so keep that in mind. And Jesus answers them that there will be all sorts of deceptions. people rising up, claiming to be the Messiah. There will be wars and rumors of other wars. And in a time where media travels very slowly, and you might not hear about a war for more than a year taking place, that kind of thing is common. You'll hear, oh, there's a war in this other place, and it comes much later. So Jesus is talking about all the kind of things that would come. And this begins to happen. In Jerusalem, in 66 AD, there begins to be civil war inside of the city of Jerusalem. Jews fighting against one another. Because there are some who don't want to rebel against the Romans, there's some that do. And it ends up that in that civil war, those who want to rebel against the Romans win. And they end up leading the rebellion against the Romans. But in the midst of all of these happenings over the next 4 decades, the Christians must learn patience. False teachers will come, frightening rumors of natural disasters, and a temptation to panic and think that this must be the end. But Jesus says that when those signs come, it's only the beginning of the birth pangs. Right? It does not mean it is the end yet. The end will come soon, right? As birth is not put off very long once birth pains start, it's going to happen. And so that is a warning to them. Now, the call for the church then is to endure, okay? A call to endure, and Jesus' words point towards a persecuted church in the next paragraph, what they're facing under Nero. And so it's easy to place that passage in the context for the difficulties that Christians faced. Jesus says that in this, the gospel will be preached to all nations. And that statement probably is seen as being fulfilled in the gospel going to Rome, as Rome was considered the melting pot of all nations. That the gospel going to Rome is a picture of it going to every nation. It's not something of going out to all nations, but reaching every ethnic group, okay? When the word nation comes up, it's important to know that in the Greek, anytime the word nation is used, it's an ethnic group, not a geographical border or political region. The word is ethnos, and that means people, not physical sovereign nation, okay? So the gospel going to all people. Families handing over families, which happens in the Neronian persecution. And so the historical context of these events and these things happening are quite striking as we see them taking place. So what will their paradigm be? Well, Jesus says, if you endure till the end, you will be saved. Okay, so Jesus' promise to them is not the one we want to hear. Times are going to be really hard, and then I'll come and save you. That's what we want, right? This idea of the rapture, that kind of idea is times are going to get really, really tough, and then you're just going to be taken away. That is not a biblical idea. The biblical idea is times are going to get really, really hard, so endure. And then when you're martyred, then you'll know you're saved. That's the promise of Jesus. Endure until the end, and you'll know you'll be saved. And that's a scary thought. But that's what Jesus says here. That's how you know. And for the church facing this persecution, it is an incredibly important theme. In fact, persecution is one of the most common themes in the New Testament, and is an incredibly important theme in the book of Revelation as well. That there's a call to faithfulness for the difficulties ahead for the church. Not about escaping, but about enduring. But what Jesus does say is that when you see the abomination of desolation, then you should flee. Okay. Now, the question is if this is about the end of the world, why should you run away? Fleeing from something is not going to make any difference if the world is coming to an end. Okay. So there must be something else that's ending, right? And it seems to be the temple and everything that goes with it. So flee the abomination. Well, the abomination of desolation was that event we talked about where Antiochus Epiphanes set up a idol in the temple precincts, and he offered a pig on the altar to Zeus in 163 BC. But Jesus says there will be another moment. And in about 65, 66, there was a dispute in the temple precincts area, and a Roman contingent of soldiers marched into the temple precincts with a standard of Caesar. Now, usually they would not do that. Usually they would leave that back at the Fortress Antonia, which was connected to the temple precincts, because they recognized that it was an idolatrous symbol. It had images of Caesar on it, it had an eagle on it, and it was the pride of Rome, was all these things, okay, on this standard. But they marched into the temple precincts with the standard, the battle standard. And this is seen as a moment of the kind of this abomination of desolation, as an idol is brought directly into the temple grounds. What ends up happening is that Christians begin to flee Jerusalem. From this point on, Christians will leave the city of Jerusalem, and there are testimonies of the Christians recognizing this moment of an idol being brought into the temple, and they begin to leave Jerusalem and move to Pella. Okay, so during the Jewish revolts, all the Christians leave the city because of Mark chapter 13, Matthew chapter 24, and also in Luke. All these passages about the destruction of the temple, we look at them and we say the end of the world. They looked at them as the destruction of the temple because it is a historical event to us, but was a future prophesied event to them. Okay, so Christians begin to leave the city as they recognize this event happening, and there is no record of Christians being in the city at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, now when Jerusalem falls, we already knew that it started with civil war inside of the city, and so the city of Jerusalem begins to face incredible difficulties with the Romans besieging them. Okay, and we see that kind of dramatic language going on here. And we'll see this in just a moment, this cosmic catastrophe idea, but the dramatic language that comes up at the end of this prior paragraph sounds very, very harsh, right? Incredible things happening to the city. And this is what seems to happen in Jerusalem at the time. In fact, when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, it says that the people in the city were starving to such a degree that they were eating leather and sticks just to have something in their stomach, because there was nothing to eat in the city. The testimonies will say that more Jews died at the hand of their fellow brothers than at the hand of the Romans over the 4 years of the Jewish war, because there was such intense civil war inside of the city that they killed each other. Families were killing families. And Josephus tells us that people got to such a desperate state in their lives that they were boiling babies in soup just to put something in their stomach. Which is also what's reported as happening in Jerusalem in 586 when Babylon is besieging the city. And while these things, the language sounds otherworldly, it says, if God didn't cut that time short, would anybody have been saved from the devastation? And the answer is probably no. They all would have died in the city. And the Romans come in and slaughter a ton of people, but there are people who are saved from this devastation. And all these signs and the sufferings and the warnings are meant to point to people the fact that Jerusalem is destined for destruction. And while other messiahs might come, in fact, the reason the revolt primarily started is someone was claiming to be a Messiah figure and leading the revolt against the Romans. And there will be false messiahs who come, and they've got to be aware of this. Now, the language then that comes up next in the next paragraph that seems this cosmic stars in the sky and moon turning to blood and sun being darkened, all these things are very cosmic language. But because you guys haven't studied the prophets, and most people haven't, they begin to interpret this through a end of the world lens, rather than through a historical event and happening. And this is common prophetic language. Places this language specifically in this paragraph comes from Isaiah 13:10 and 34:4, talking about the destruction of the nations of Babylon and Edom, which were both historical events. And so the language Jesus is using is cosmic prophetic language to talk about actual historical events taking place. And you could just sum up the entire time through a historical narrative by talking about the fact that The emperor had committed suicide, and the Roman Empire was in such disarray for a whole year, with 4 different emperors coming to power. There was murder and civil war in the city of Rome. But the biblical story and the biblical writers tend to use very dramatic language to describe such events happening, rather than just using the historical, factual terms that we would prefer them to use. Okay. Now, why should we think this? Well, it might seem like the end of the world to us, but to the Jews in Jerusalem, it would have really seemed like the end of the world. And it probably seemed like the end of their world as this was happening. But there is a key phrase that helps us in looking at this passage, and that is what is spoken by Jesus in verse 30. Okay, when Jesus says the word truly, he means it, right? I'm serious. Truly, I say to you, blah, blah, blah. And here he says, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. I can assure you with such seriousness that even heaven and earth would pass away before my words will pass away. Right? So he's saying that you can take it to the bank, right? This will happen, and it will happen within a generation. And the biblical generation is understood to be 40 years. And about 40 years later, 70 AD, from Jesus' ministry, 40 years, the temple is destroyed and the city of Jerusalem falls. And from that point until this very day, the temple has never been rebuilt, and not a single sacrifice has ever been offered in Jerusalem. Did Jesus' words come to pass? Absolutely. And so Mark chapter 13 is one of the most important testimonies to Jesus' prophetic ministry, in that it has happened already. Now, what about this coming on the clouds? What is that deal? Is Jesus returning on the clouds? Well, the coming on the clouds idea comes from Daniel chapter 7. And when somebody, specifically in that passage, when this figure comes on the clouds, he's not coming from heaven to earth. He's going to heaven. The cloud rider, as we could call him, is always somebody that is riding to the throne room of God. And Daniel chapter 7 shows it that way. Okay. And why is that important? Because, well, let me just read it and I'll explain it. So Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. This is important because Jesus will also bring it up in his trial before the high priest. Okay, so Daniel chapter 7, he says, verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man, which is Jesus' favorite title for himself. He's the only one who uses it. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So this figure is brought before Yahweh in heaven. And to him, the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So when Jesus talks about coming on the clouds, this is like the most bold messianic claim he can make, which is why when the high priest, when Jesus says, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in glory, the priest tears his clothes because he knows the passage from Daniel. Right? That's going to happen in chapter 14. But whenever Jesus talks about coming on the clouds, it's not about his return to earth. It's about his ascension to heaven, to his rightful place of glory. All right. So just a couple things to finish out this chapter real quick. So the nations are going to come and take the city of Jerusalem. The pagans will arrive, and this will be a sign of the end of the temple. And that's exactly what Jesus had said in chapter 12 of the parable of the tenants. I will come, I will destroy those evil tenants, and I will take this place away from it, and I will give it to others. And those others are seen as the pagan nations who have since occupied Jerusalem from that day until today. It's no wonder that a Muslim mosque is built in the place where the temple once stood. So it's a worthy question to consider. Does God want the temple to be rebuilt? Or is what is presently there a fulfillment of the words of Jesus? Now, what Jesus says to his disciples at the end there is to stay awake. Now, this is going to be an important instruction in a few days as Jesus is in the garden with a few disciples who fall asleep. Stay awake, be aware of the signs of the end times. Okay, the end of this times, the ends of the temple's times. Right? That's what Jesus is talking about. So stay awake, be awake. He says 4 times in this passage, stay awake. So it's pretty clear. I don't think you can get any clearer than that, right? That's what they're to do. Now, when Jesus says this, stay awake, right? When the thief comes in the night, when nobody knows when he would come, that is never supposed to be surprising for Christians. Okay? To us, Jesus will not come like a thief in the night. We know the signs of the times. We know and we will recognize. We don't know when he will come, but when he comes, we will recognize his coming. Remember First Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul says, you are not children of the night to sleep during the nighttime, but you are children of the day living in the nighttime. And all of believers are supposed to live awake because we are awake in the darkness. We are awake in the night. And while the world sleeps in darkness, believers are awake to recognize the signs of the times and what God is doing. And so Jesus says again here, stay awake, be awake. All right, chapter 14. So chapter 14 starts the story of this woman coming to Jesus and breaking this alabaster vial of perfume. Says it's worth about 300 denarii, which is about a year's worth of wages. Okay, that's a lot of money. This is like a $30,000 bottle of perfume. And she comes and breaks it on Jesus, right? And this is her lavish worship. Right? Now, all the disciples and all the others standing by are indignant at the situation. They're upset. Couldn't have just been sold. We use that money for something else, like helping the poor. Jesus says, you don't recognize what's going on. And we don't know if the woman recognized either spiritually what was going on. We don't know if she knew that she was anointing him for burial, but that's what Jesus interprets it as. And the interesting thing is that while all of the men in these passages are going to get it wrong, they're going to flee from Jesus, they're going to deny him, they will crucify him, that the women in these passages are seen as the true models of discipleship. The woman who breaks the alabaster jar, the women who stand at the cross, the women who go to the grave first thing in the morning. And so Mark is contrasting these images in the end of the gospel for those who miss it and those who see it. So Judas, after this moment, goes to the high priest to betray Jesus. Now, why does Judas betray Jesus? And there's a couple of points I just want to make really quick, and that is that the fact that none of the disciples knew that Judas was the bad guy is shocking to me. Because it just shows how much Jesus loved him and treated him the same as everybody else. When Jesus knew that Judas would betray him in the end, nobody else knew it. How much love and care does it take to make everybody think the same thing about one another, even when the leader knows that one of them is going to betray him? I think it's astounding. Now, the other thing I think that's important to consider is, did Judas think he was betraying Jesus? Because I find it quite odd that after Judas has gotten money to hand over Jesus, that even at the Last Supper, he says, is it me? And he doesn't seem to know. And so what I think might be going on here is something along these lines, where Judas had been like James and John and Peter. He was expecting to go into Jerusalem and take the city with Jesus. When he goes into the city and Jesus is not starting a revolt, what is he going to try to do? Well, he's going to try to back Jesus into a corner. And he's going to try to get him to revolt, right? He's going to try to get him to be the Messiah that Judas thinks he should be. And so he hands him over to the chief priest and he says, okay, I'm going to show you where he's at night, because this is where it's going to start, at night. Come with your clubs, come with your swords. Now, Judas knows the disciples have swords also. That's why they're ready to fight. But when Jesus hands himself over, that's where Judas realizes he has just betrayed Jesus. When Jesus gives himself up, it's at that moment Judas realizes what he has done and goes and commits suicide.
Do you think that Jesus always knew that Judas was going to betray him?
I do. Yeah, because he says in his passion predictions, the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of the leaders. I think it's in the Gospel of Matthew or Luke, that theme is developed, where it says, the Son of Man will be betrayed, the Son of Man will be betrayed. And then in the third passion prediction, or it's in the Last Supper, he says, the Son of Man will be betrayed by one of you. And so he builds up this point, and at that point, they're all shocked. Like, what do you mean, one of us? So, and I think that partly plays into this fact of, I think Judas is trying to get Jesus to be the Messiah that he wants him to be, which begs the question of all of us, are there things in our lives where we're trying to make Jesus in our image or what we desire instead of allowing him to be the person that he is? So that's what I think with Judas. They are, after that story, they set up the room in the Passover. And it's interesting, they know where to set it up because a man is carrying a water jar. Quite an interesting detail, probably an eyewitness detail, because women carry water jars, not men. So when you find a man carrying a water jar, it's probably Jesus says that's where we're going to set up. So they have the Passover, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, talks about his betrayer, and then they go into the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, this is where Jesus had gone before. In fact, he'd spent time there in the past. And that's why Judas knew where he was going to find him. But what do we see with Jesus in this moment? When Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, he is full of so many emotions. He's distressed, troubled, very sorrowful. Is it doubt to have these kinds of emotions when walking into the will of God? Do we confront people on the expression of their emotions when they're doing the will of God? Oh, you should have faith. Just trust this is what God is calling you into. If you have emotions that seem like doubt, is that wrong? I don't think it's the emotions that are the primary dictator, but the response to the emotions. What does Jesus do with them? He goes straight to his Father in prayer. These emotions come out of Psalm 42:5, 42:11, and 43:5, and kind of what is being expressed there about the situations. The same language is used in the Greek Septuagint and in this passage. And so what does Jesus pray? He prays this interesting prayer to me. It says he fell on the ground and he prayed. If it were possible, the hour might pass from him. That's what he prayed. Father, if it's possible, let this hour pass from me. Remove this cup from me. It can be comforting to know that at this moment, Jesus was not ready to do the will of the Father. He says, yet not what I will, but what you will. And what God calls us to is not always what we want. If Jesus experienced that, you can bet your pants that we will too. Not everything God calls us to is things we want to do. And when Jesus prays for deliverance, if there's any other way, I don't want to do this right now. I am not ready to do this. Let this cup pass from me. That's what I want right now. What is God's answer? no. And if Jesus received a no in prayer to a moment where he was distressed and sorrowful and troubled over the will of God, then we have got to have room in our paradigm of what God would speak to us to hear the same thing in our own lives. That no matter how much we desire to do something, that if God says no, that we listen. He sets a model. And think about the Christians in Rome, what they're facing, the difficulties of their circumstances, and this is what Jesus gets in prayer. What would they think about this? How would they feel when they are facing similar circumstances of death and persecution? Lord, just deliver me from this. Protect me from it. I don't want to be a witness right now. Too bad. Do we only think that God's best for us is our best for ourselves? So Jesus is arrested in the garden at that point after praying 3 times. You know, it's crazy. 3 times he goes to his Father with the same prayer. And every time it's a no. I don't think it's doubt to go over and over in prayer over a tough decision that you're not ready to make. Jesus did it in the garden. He gets arrested, he's brought on trial. And you want to pay attention to where he's on trial and who he's on trial with throughout all of these settings, because we can kind of have a skewed view that everybody turns their back on Jesus in this moment, but they don't. At this moment, it is just the leaders. So Jesus is brought into the high priest's home. Now, the high priest's home, his courtyard, would have been about half the size of this room. Okay, it could fit, about 30 people standing room in there. Okay, pretty comfortably. So this is not happening in a giant courtroom and the high priest is standing up and Jesus is down there. This is happening face to face. The high priest is talking to Jesus face to face in a small courtyard area with about 30 other people in there, priests, religious leaders, elders, scribes. These are the people who've arrested and brought Jesus to this place, and this is who he's on trial for. And so Peter follows him at a distance right to the courtyard of the high priest. And so he's waiting with him just at that area. Right? That's why when Peter is denying Jesus, it says that Jesus looked at Peter in the eyes. Because they're probably only about 15 feet from each other or 20 feet from each other. It's not like far away. This is all happening in a very small area. It'd be like being on trial right here and Peter's at the back of the room and you can see him denying you. You look back at him. This is all happening in very close space. And they're all bringing these accusations against him. And Jesus' response is silence, right? They can't even agree on the accusations against Jesus. And what ends up happening is the high priest says, do you have anything to say for yourself? Have you no answer to make? And he responds, he remains silent. The high priest says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And this is directly back to Psalm 110, the passage he quoted in the temple just a few days earlier. That Psalm 110 actually becomes the most quoted psalm in the entire New Testament. And it alludes, in the passage, of course, you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. That is direct allusion to the Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 passage. This is what Jesus says about himself in the high priest's presence. And the high priest cannot help but react to this claim. It's not a light claim. He is making an incredibly bold claim to be the Messiah, to be worthy to sit in heaven next to God. And that his rightful place is next to his Father in heaven. And at the same time as all of this trial is happening, Peter is right outside the courtyard denying Jesus. And what you see is a strong contrast between Jesus and Peter. Jesus is being open and honest about himself. He's honest and he stands on the truth of his identity, while Peter is closed off and deceiving the people around him in hopes of preserving his identity. And while Jesus retains his integrity at the cost of his life, Peter loses his integrity to save his own skin. And while Jesus is being accused of being a false prophet by everybody in that courtyard, his prophecy about Peter's denial is coming true just a few feet away. What would the Roman Christians do when faced with the opportunity to deny Jesus like Peter did? And it's the story at the end of John about Peter being restored after his denials, when Jesus says, feed my sheep, or do you love me, feed my sheep? That probably comes because of Mark's gospel, where Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, and then he was martyred. Did Peter actually ever be restored? Was he fully restored? Well, the story comes about 30 years later in John's gospel that yes, he was restored by Jesus on the beach in Galilee. All right, so just a connection point for us. So chapter 15 comes along and they deliver Jesus over to Pilate. And as they deliver Jesus over to Pilate, they need to present Jesus in such a way that Pilate would understand. Okay, so they don't come to him and say, this guy's claiming to be the Messiah. They come to him and say, he's claiming to be the King of the Jews. Okay, so they're reconveying Jesus' identity and his claims in a way that would provoke Pilate to have to deal with the situation. And of course, Pilate asks him, are these things true? Are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus is like, well, you've said so. The words came out of your mouth. Do you think so? Then great. But Jesus is silent before all of his accusations. Nothing, no response from Jesus. And Pilate recognizes Jesus' innocence. He recognizes that there's no reason that he should be crucified. That's Pilate's assessment. And so what ends up happening is he's going to be provoked into doing it. But before that takes place, we have this interesting story about Pilate's tradition to release one man at the Passover. Okay. Why? Well, this tradition is not recorded in any other place, not in Josephus, not in any Roman annals or anything like that. So why does Pilate do this? And I've thought a lot about this because it just seems so weird to do this at some random feast of the Jews to give them one prisoner. And my personal thought, and I can't verify this with a dictionary or commentary, is that Pilate, I think he lets a prisoner go at the Passover because it partners with the history of Passover. And he's trying to appease the Jews. I'm joining in with your traditions in the same way that you were freed from slavery and the captors, your oppressors, the Egyptians, so I will free for you one slave or one prisoner as well and release him to you. So that's my thought on it. And so there's this tradition, and Jesus is then put up. He says, well, okay, I have this tradition. Why don't we let Jesus go? It doesn't seem that he is guilty of any crimes. And then we get this explanation of who Barabbas is. And so we have this insurrectionist or this rebel who has been violent and murderous towards people. He deserves to be on the cross, not Jesus. And they say, Pilate does not offer Barabbas, right? The crowd says, or the high priests say to Pilate, give us Barabbas. Now, one of the important things to realize is that high priests and the scribes are trying to keep this very low key. Very hush-hush. They come to Pilate early in the morning, probably before he's even woken up. They arrest Jesus in the middle of the night. They come to Pilate very early, probably before the sun has even risen. And they're basically banging on Pilate's door, help us get this sorted out as quickly as possible, which is why they're trying to move it very, very quickly. You focus on what they're doing, and they try to force the hand over and over and over because they're trying to get Jesus on the cross before the crowds wake up, before people can protest. And the people around Pilate in his home at Pilate's house is a very small group of people. It's a crowd. It's probably still about 30 people, but it's not a mob. We kind of think that the crowd turns their back on Jesus. No, these are the people who've always been against Jesus since Mark's Gospel, chapter 3. So Jesus takes the place of Barabbas. Now, the name Barabbas means son of the Father. And so we have Jesus, the true Son of the Father in heaven, taking the place of the Son of the Father, Barabbas, so that Barabbas could be like Jesus, as Jesus becomes like Barabbas. And Pilate didn't want to crucify Jesus. He has him scourged, sent away to be beaten at the prompting of the high priest, who shout, "Crucify him." And in John's gospel, it says they're shouting to him, he has made himself king. And if you let this man live, you are no friend of Caesar's. And that's true. If it had been found out that a king was leading a revolt somewhere in the empire and the governor of that province had let him live, the governor would be forced to commit suicide. And so Pilate is thinking about his own skin in these situations ultimately. And so he has him crucified. So he's sent away and beaten and scourged. And the Roman scourge was a whip that was multi-stringed with bone and rock in it to tear the flesh of an individual. It was a punishment in and of itself. It was not always something that was done just before a crucifixion. And the scourging of an individual would rip open their flesh, exposing the bones on their back through the thin layers of skin, ripping through nerves, and potentially sending the victim into shock just from the whipping itself. Now, when Jesus then is mocked and beaten in accordance with his own identity, right, as the King of the Jews, this is it supposed to be seen as an ironic thing, a suffering king. They get his identity right, but they mock him because his identity does not fit the standard of the world's values of what a king looks like. Now, the cross was not just a, like we talked about yesterday, this is a picture of sacrifice and forgiveness. It is a political symbol for them as much as it has become a religious symbol for us. Pilate knew, the crowds knew, the chief priests knew, and Jesus knew exactly what the cross meant. It was the ultimate symbol of Roman power. It was what showed that wherever Rome went, we are in charge here. And this is what will happen to anybody who gets in our way. When Jesus was just a boy, and there was that revolt in Galilee, the Romans crucified thousands of Jews. When Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, they crucified more thousands, to the point that they ran out of wood to crucify people on. The Romans got bored with how to crucify someone normally, so they experimented with hanging people in different positions until the point that there were no more trees around Jerusalem to hang people on. Between those two revolts in Israel, the Romans crucified many, many people on very small pretexts. This was not a once-in-a-lifetime happening. This was a regular event. Jesus was just seen as another crucified Jew. Now, the word cross or crucifixion was such an abominable act that even the Romans realized how terrible this was. And polite Romans would not even use the word cross or crucifix in polite settings. They wouldn't even talk about it on the street. In fact, if you remember when I was reading from Tacitus's Annals, chapter 15, section 44 on Monday or on Tuesday, when he says, and Christus received the ultimate punishment, not even Tacitus can say that he was crucified. This is what they thought. But Jesus saw that this was his Father's will, and he was going to go through with it. So what was crucifixion like? Well, as we mentioned before, it's one of the most brutal forms of punishment in any period of history. And the English word that we use, excruciating, has its origins in the word crucifixion from the Greek and Latin. First, the person was beaten in varying levels of severity, and then they would carry the crossbar. They would not carry the whole cross. Okay, they wouldn't carry this whole thing. They would only carry this part. Well, the Romans left this part in the ground so that it was easy to hoist people up onto it. It's very hard to drop it into a hole every time. Usually they would drop it into a hole once, and so they would use concrete. And by the way, the Romans invented concrete. So you put concrete in a hole, put the post in the ground, and then the person going to the cross would carry the crossbar on their shoulders. Jesus, of course, has been beaten to such severity that he's not able to carry it. Once a person arrived at that pole in the ground, they would be stripped naked, which we often don't depict in our pictures of Jesus, but he would have been completely naked. And then they drive nails through their wrists. They drive through their wrists right here, not through here. And the reason they do through here is because the small bones in the hand are so fragile, and the flesh here is so fragile, that the weight of your body would rip straight through, and you would fall off the cross that way. And so they would put it through your wrists, and because of the two bones that run through here, it would keep it locked in, right? And so they would nail them to the cross that way. And the same thing goes with the feet. Your feet have so many small bones on the top of your foot, they would not nail through the top of the foot. What we have more recently found out is that usual Roman crucifixion would nail someone's legs to the sides of the cross through the bones around their ankle. And so they'd be nailed to the sides, and they would hang straddling the cross rather than foot over foot. Okay. And then over the course of anywhere from 1 to 3 days, a person would pull themselves up every couple of seconds to get a breath as the nails scraped on the bones and tore the flesh in their wrists and their ankles for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. A lot of people died from shock. Some people died from heart failure because of lack of sleep, and others died from asphyxiation because they could not breathe, and they would drown above ground. When the Romans grew tired of how long people survived on the cross, they would break their legs. So they would die faster, and they couldn't breathe. They would take a very large sledgehammer, and they would shatter the femur in their legs, so that every time they tried to push themselves up with their legs to get a breath, the femur bones would grind on each other and tear through the legs, the muscles in their legs. And that's what happens to the thieves on the cross next to Jesus, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests want them to come down off the cross before the Passover feast so that no one is on the cross during the Sabbath. They're so concerned about keeping the Sabbath that they say break their legs so that they die first. Right. And that's what's because the day is getting long. In fact, Joseph of Arimathea goes and gets the body of Jesus at the closing moments of the day. He's trying to get him into the ground before the Sabbath starts. He rushes the process. And so that's what crucifixion was like. Jesus is going to be crucified and can't carry his own crossbar. And they find this man, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the crossbar for him. And it probably mentions Alexander and Rufus because they're known to the church. in Rome. In Romans chapter 16, verse 13, and Jesus is led to the place of the skull, Golgotha. He's stripped naked, and he's nailed to the cross with a placard that's placed above his head that reads, King of the Jews. And every criminal had one of these placards to say what they had done wrong. And it is the moment that we consider to be one of the most shameful and torturous moments in Jesus' life that he recognizes as the moment of his ultimate glorification as the king. And if he recognizes that as the ultimate moment of his glory as king, what does it show us about what our kingdom values should be? Sacrifice, obedience, servant-heartedness. The world's view of a king is not what God was aligning himself with. And we've got to wrestle with this personally the same way the church has throughout history. Jesus is on the cross for about 6 hours, which is an incredibly short period of time. And that's why Pilate is so shocked that Jesus is already dead. Right? Joseph of Arimathea comes to Pilate and says, can I have the body of Jesus? And Pilate is like, are you serious? It's only been a few hours. Right? So he sends a centurion, go and double check if Jesus is actually dead. He comes back and says, he is. Okay, give him the body. Jesus should have lasted a lot longer. He doesn't. But on the cross, Jesus cries out in these final moments from Psalm 22. And we kind of take this passage, and most people ask, well, how could God turn his back on Jesus? Or how does that actually happen? And there's a separation of why have you forsaken me? Did you guys read Psalm 22 at all in connection with this passage in Luke? I'm going to read it for you. So Jesus quotes Psalm 22, verse 1. Now, like we said before, when an author quotes a passage in the Bible, you want to go back to the whole context of that passage. So we're going to read Psalm 22. It's a little bit long, but it's worth our time to read. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why? And keeping in mind, this is written 1,000 years before Jesus. 1,000 years before Jesus is born. This is written by David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and they were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust in you at my mother's breast. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like raving and roaring lions. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me, and they have pierced my hands and feet. I count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothes they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You've rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All you offspring of Israel, for he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cried to him. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For the kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. They shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. That's what Jesus has in his mind when he's making this quotation. He recognizes, I've been nailed. My clothes have been gambled for, right? He knows what's happening. He knows this is Psalm 22. And when he confesses that on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's talking about the whole situation that follows with this. And those are the last words of Jesus. He cries out and has his last breath, and there's an earthquake, and the veil in the temple is torn in two. And we often talk about the veil being torn as God making the way for everybody to come into his presence, right? And that's true, kind of true, because when the veil was torn, could anybody come into the presence of God? No. Okay. Only the priests. Because the priests are the only ones who can enter into the temple. And so the tearing of the veil doesn't actually make a way for all of Israel to come in. It makes a way for the priests to pass through the veil into the Holy of Holies, which is only where the high priest could go. Now, that it makes more sense then why we would be called then a kingdom of priests. Okay? The tearing of the veil doesn't make a way for everybody. It makes a way for the priests to come into the presence of God, in the same way that Jesus passed through the curtain and made a way for all of us to enter in. But I think even more than that, the death of Christ, the earthquake, and the tearing of the veil demonstrates the judgment that is inevitable for the temple in Jerusalem. The tearing of the veil is symbolic for God's presence leaving the temple. God is tearing the veil from top to bottom, leaving the temple and declaring judgment upon the city of Jerusalem. And this is an affirmation of what Jesus had said in chapter 13. And I think that fits better with the context of what's going on and the inevitable destruction of Jerusalem in only a few decades. But the most shocking statement is what comes out of a Gentile's mouth, that at the death of Christ, a Gentile would say of him that this man truly was the Son of God. And it's interesting that the first person in the Gospel of Mark to recognize Jesus correctly is a Gentile and a Roman soldier. Now, if you are Mark's original readers, being persecuted by Roman soldiers, arrested, brought before arenas, sewn into the skins of wild animals, burned alive, crucified, and Jesus's death convinces a Roman centurion that this really was the Son of God, it would, I think, give faith and encouragement that as though one grain of wheat might fall to the ground, it will not be left unfruitful. You know, that they can have faith that their sacrifice may have the same impact upon their persecutors as Jesus's death had upon those who were in the direct vicinity of him. And the fact that a Gentile, a soldier, Roman, is the first to recognize who Jesus actually is. Now, chapter 16 is the glorious moment that follows along after these challenging stories. And the resurrection story is amazing, right? The empty tomb. These women come to the tomb in the morning, and Jesus is not there. The most glorious news that could have ever been spoken. The affirmation of Jesus' words, the fulfillment to his prophecies, and his statements about his resurrection 3 times in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus here is gone. He's no longer in the tomb. He has been raised, just as he said. Now, this story in the early church would be a little disgraceful for the church trying to witness to people about Jesus' resurrection, because already nobody believed in the resurrection presently. Jews believed it would happen sometime, but it doesn't happen to one person. It happens to everybody at the same time. Greeks and Romans would have completely disagreed. There was no such thing as resurrection. In fact, there's a play at the Areopagus at its dedication, which is where Paul testified about resurrection in Acts chapter 17. At the dedication, there is a line in that play from the god Apollo where he says, when the blood of man is spilled on the ground, there is no resurrection. That's the basic understanding for any Greco-Roman thinker. So already that's a challenging moment. But the fact that two women are the ones who are the first testifiers to this would have been completely absurd. Because women's testimony in a court of law at this time in history was unacceptable. In fact, if women witnessed a crime, the criminal could not be convicted because the women didn't count as witnesses in the court of law. So when you have two women who are testifying to a resurrection from the dead, that's absurd. And the reason that we take this to be one of the most trustworthy pieces of evidence about the resurrection of Jesus Christ is that because the church never changed their story, no matter how disgraceful it was. And historically, this is one of the greatest pieces of evidence to the validity of the resurrection, is at a time when it was completely disgraceful, the church stood by it as being the true story. And they recorded it in 3 different places. It's interesting that the first person to write about the resurrection, Paul the Apostle in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, does not talk about women being the first witnesses. I just think it's interesting. Now, this has nothing to do with his view of women. I think there is nothing to be argued about how much Paul affirmed women in ministry, but I do think that's an interesting observation. Of course, they go to the tomb, they arrive in utter shock, and they leave with this thought of fear in their hearts. And they say, it says, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now you have a note in your Bible that says, chapter 16, 9 through 20 is not in the earliest manuscripts. We'll talk about that in a second. So chapter 16, verse 8 is the last verse that would be affirmed in our earliest manuscript copies of Mark. Now, why would Mark end his gospel this way? Now, there's a lot of scholars who think Mark didn't end his gospel this way, and that actually the true ending of Mark was lost, and was probably our best reproduction is Matthew chapter 28, is the biggest similarity to what Mark might have had at the end of his gospel, because Matthew uses Mark. But we don't have the end of Mark's gospel. We just don't. Some people suggest it deteriorated because it's the end of a scroll. Maybe it got ripped off on accident. Something happened and it was just destroyed. But if Mark ended his gospel this way in 16 verse 8, it begs the question of any Roman Christian, are you going to have the same response to Jesus' resurrection? Will you go home in fear, not willing to tell anybody about it? Or are you going to be a faithful witness like Christ has called you to go and tell people about the resurrection of Jesus Christ? That's one option. The other option is this extra ending bit. Now, the extra ending begins to show up in later manuscript copies because most scribes began to notice this is a cliffhanger and it doesn't fit the literary style of the ancient world. Not to say that people couldn't write outside of that, but it just was incredibly uncommon, nearly absolutely unheard of. And so what they began to do is add in the ending of various endings to Mark. And the most common one, and the one that most reflects Mark's style, is 9 through 20. And this of course gives us these stories. One that is repeated in Luke, the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, very similar. And there's a few things that are similar to Matthew. But then we get the Great Commission at the end of this ending, which calls the disciples to go and to preach the gospel, give this amazing testimony to the resurrection of Jesus, that he has appeared to them. And I think that ending, as much as any one, would be sufficient to ask the question, what will you do next? What will be your response? Is this just a good story to hear and to listen to? Or is this something that will provoke the listeners to actually do what was explained in the book? It's a good question for us to think about as well. How will we respond at the end of this story? Let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for the book of Mark. The challenges, difficulties, God, but the amazing encouragements. Lord, the joy of what you have given in your life and in the promises that you have made. And Lord, I pray that we would live in light of it, God. Would you help us to be people who walk in accordance with your ways, God, who live to bring glory to you, Jesus, to walk with you each day closer and closer. We love you so much, Jesus. Thank you for your resurrection and the life that you give to us and the hope that we have in the kingdom to come and the kingdom that's invading this earth right now. Lord, would you be blessed through our study of your scriptures. In Jesus' name, amen. Woo! Yes.
We have the card gift for you.
Thank you so much.
I want to give you guys the opportunity to encourage Krista, the things that you received this week. Opportunity for you guys to respond.
Yeah, thank you for, just sharing, the truth, even the background information about passages that are, like, honestly, I think if I had pastor of my church with misinterpreted, we need somebody who knows Bible, really about misinterpreted parts, that you had, that kind of little out of context, but yeah, thank you for sharing just the truth of this. Even though it probably isn't easy for you to first hear, and definitely probably isn't easy for you to share, especially if you probably see it's all just looking away. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Hopefully it wasn't easy to hear, but it was also definitely freeing.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wisdom that you got. I think it was a very well explained, the whole book, honestly. But also it's nice because there's a special element of your passion in it, and like we can see the passion in you as you're speaking. So yeah, very much appreciate the teaching. You're amazing, and it's rough, man. Thank you so much. Honestly.
I could really see God at the center of your teaching, and when I heard you speak, I knew it wasn't just you speaking, but like God and the Holy Spirit using you to share this wisdom with us. And yeah, like every word you said had some meaning, had some value. You weren't just speaking for the sake of it. I really appreciate that.
Thank you also for your commitment to keep studying yourself over the years and keep being part of this movement to bring the truth through the word. I can imagine there would be tons of opportunities left and right for that kind of ministry. But thank you for sticking with this call that you have for a while.
Yeah, thank you for being blunt and bold to end on a problem. I think, we as young people need this. We need the truth. We need the black and white essence of it. And thank you for being bold in that and setting a tone and example for us to follow in that as well.
How can we pray for you?
Yeah, so you can pray for me, Gene Alexander. I'm still gone another week from him, so just pray for grace. And then, I think the major thing right now, we were in a car accident in October. I think I mentioned this to you guys already in prayer. It's the same kind of thing as last time. So Miji's still going to the chiropractor and some things for her back from that. So you just pray for full healing over her. And we've seen improvement, which is great. And so just believe for the full healing, and then for some provisions with car, which is kind of for that. So those two things I think.
Okay, maybe we can just stretch our hands and pray. And then maybe I can have maybe I can have Yuka to pray for Krista to close. So everyone pray scripture and then pray for Krista, pray for Miji, pray for Alexander. Alright, and then have Yuka to close.
Yes, God, we want to thank you for Krista's life. We want to thank you that you've taken hold of him years ago to this call to follow you, God, and you've kept that hold, and you've allowed him to really see you face to face in many occasions, God. We thank you that you have poured this element of teaching and research and studying into him, that he's so freely sharing with many around him, God. We just want to ask that you would stir a greater hunger to keep studying and that understanding that you keep revealing yourself to him because he's so generous with what he has and he wants to share that with others. We ask that kind of anointing, we ask that kind of a revelation fresh again on him and his life. And for the whole family, we ask for your blessing while he's traveling, he's committing this call that he has for his life to teach others and help others to see you, God, more and fresh. We ask your blessing over Miji and her back. We ask that full healing that they're asking. And you say so many times that ask and ask and ask, and we ask that full healing on behalf of them, on behalf of her, at this very moment, God, that everything will take back in the proper place, and she would know that it's been healed by you, Jesus. And that's again another testimony of your goodness, your kindness, and your faithfulness in their life. Bless also Alexander while he's there. Help him to bless his mom, God, and we ask that you would give them the wisdom to teach him in the early days the ways of God, and that he will take them into his heart because of their faithfulness, because of Krista's and Minji's faithfulness to you, God. And we pray for the provision for the car, that would come, and the car would not be just a car, but it would be an amazing car for years to come for their families. We bless them, and we thank you, God, for sending them this mission and for this work. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, cafe. I want to say cafe and speaker's table. So let's have lunch with Krista. It's already set up, so Monica's already there now. And then the second thing is remember the period desk for the PM team. And remember those people that you're going to show love with. This might be your last day if you haven't done it already. Be intentional. Yeah, is that good? Okay. Stan, is there anything else to announce?
Yes, I don't have it with me, but just getting ready for departure day. Maybe I'll have a sheet this afternoon and tomorrow. If you just put your details on where you're going to be and if you need to drive to the train station or something along those lines, that would be really good and help. I'll bring it after.
Good. All right, let's go to lunch.
Thank you, Christopher.